so far. This is where it crumbles.
Don't worry.
Yeah, okay.
Right behind you.
I know. Unless he was in
All right, if we will begin again to discuss the fourth item, which is of obvious interest to the board and has been of strong local interest, and that is the survival factors and involving obviously the types of devices that were available on the El Toro for the passengers in case of an emergency of this kind. So if you could, Ash, to give us an overview in that area, and I'm sure the members will have questions and comments for you, but if you could begin with an overview, we would appreciate it.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Survival factors issues were researched in detail by Ray Deagle, so if I may, I would defer the discussion of survival factors to him.
Ray?
Okay. Would you like me to talk about the life rafts and the devices, or the rescue itself?
Well, I would like you to talk, if you could, both. You might begin with giving us an overview again of what type of devices were equipped, the El Toro was equipped with, what Coast Guard regulations required, and then get into the actual survival.
Okay. This is the device that was aboard the El Toro. It just has ropes hanging off it, and as you can see, it's designed to accommodate 20 persons. This was the only life-saving buoyant apparatus aboard the El Toro at that time.
Where would that be on this? Is that the Lucky Lady?
Just above the pilot house. That orange-looking thing is above the pilot house.
Does the Lucky Lady have more than one? Is that what we're looking at, or is that just other?
Yes, the Lucky Lady has 2 buoyant apparatus, and it also meets the Coast Guard requirements. Each of them are smaller in size, so you can have a sum of 2 or 1 large one. You can have more than 1 smaller one or a large one.
Okay.
As it stands now, these devices are supposed to accommodate 1/3 of the passengers and crew aboard the vessel.
1/3?
1/3, yes. And that's what the El Toro was designed for. I believe it accommodates 53 individuals, including the crew.
So if you had 53 individuals and the boat sank, there isn't a flotation device for everybody?
That's right.
What about individual flotation devices?
Yes, it was equipped with life jackets
For everybody?
for everybody.
Okay.
What the Coast Guard has proposed in the new proposed regulation is those little black things are persons in the water. As you, the proposed rule, it would be to have accommodations for 100% of the people aboard the vessel. That would be in this case. As it stands now, of course, only 3. There's a qualifier here of water of 59 degrees or below. And the Coast Guard, if you're above 59 degrees, you don't need one of these devices.
These are out-of-the-water devices?
No, these are in the water
Still
devices.
in the water devices, but they're simply going to require more of them.
They're going to require 100%.
And go right ahead.
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand that. It would be 100% of in-the-water devices below 59 degrees.
That's right.
And above 59 degrees, this thing indicates you don't need to have these
That's right.
devices.
You don't need it.
Could somebody...
You do need PFDs, but not these rings. What do you call this? What do you call this?
This is a buoyant apparatus.
All right, so you don't need a buoyant apparatus above 59 degrees. You just need PFDs.
Well, right now, according to the Coast Guard regulations, you need one of these for at least 1/3 of the people aboard the vessel,
Regardless of water temperature.
regardless of water temperature.
And the new regulations would say if it's above 59 degrees, you don't need it anymore.
You don't need anything.
But if it's below 59 degrees, you need
100% of the people hanging off these
hanging
devices.
off one of these things.
I don't understand the
I don't either.
rationale for that. What, you're in the water, whether you're in the water and buoyed up by a personal flotation device or one of these, I don't see that it makes a whole lot of difference. Can somebody help me?
Yeah, the temperature, the water temperature aspect of this,
I
It doesn't
don't
seem
know
to
the
make sense.
rationale behind that.
Can anyone describe this water chill graph that the Coast Guard has?
Yeah,
You know what page it is?
Which I guess you have in the report at what page, so...
One is page 20.
Page 20.
This gives you a rough estimate of how long a person could survive in the water under these water temperatures here. And as you can see, between 50 and 60 degree water temperatures, you can last between 1 and 2 hours before you're exhausted or unconscious. And then expected time of survival would be 2 to 6 hours. That's according to how much body fat you might have or how old you are and things like that.
Is this by any chance related to the ability to locate people? They're more easily located when they're hanging on to these apparatus than if they're in PFDs and cold water. I really don't. The Coast Guard doesn't make irrational judgments most of the time. There's got to be an explanation for correlating water temperature with the use of these apparata.
The 59 degrees doesn't make any sense to me at all. I don't know why they use that figure. I have no idea.
Ralph, you're reaching for the mic, old Coast Guard man.
I don't know if I'll be able to help the board, but I think we need to separate a couple of concepts. Certainly one of the basis for which the Coast Guard provides life-saving equipment aboard any vessel, including the small passenger vessel, has to do with how far from land the vessel is going to operate, how quickly do they believe they can get rescue resources to the people if a vessel sinks. We have made comments to the Coast Guard many times that we felt that in cold water, with the limited expected survival time, that we felt that out-of-water flotation should be provided for all people aboard all passenger vessels, despite the fact that they may be close to land, or despite the fact that rescue resources would be available.
When did we first make that recommendation?
(1986).
1986.
And what I was trying to point out that this type of information that you see on page 20 is in the Coast Guard Search and Rescue Manual. Their personnel are taught concerning the effects that hypothermia will have on people, and they do consider this in providing rescue equipment aboard vessels. What we've seen and is in the report, we've said that out-of-water flotation should be provided to existing vessels as well as new vessels, since there's a large fleet of existing vessels. And the Coast Guard tends, and I think the board knows, simply to require new equipment for new vessels. And we're saying that this is not sufficient.
In a wind like this, somebody sitting in a raft like this is pictured here out of the water, I'm just assuming that their chances are better than if they were in 55 to 60 degree water. Is that
Much so.
much?
And Carl, when I went through the report yesterday, as the board members, as I know you did, asked for a copy because it had been referenced of this study of life-saving systems for small passenger vessels that the Coast Guard conducted, was conducted by the Chief of the Survival Systems Branch, Mr. R.L. Markle. And I think he indicates in there, he says on page 6, the role of water temperature on survival times, because I had some of the same questions I think the other members did, and said one of the tools used for many years in search and rescue planning is a water chill graph which estimates the probability of survival based on time and water of varying temperatures. The graph is based in part on data generated many years ago. It is concerned primarily with the effects of hypothermia and doesn't take into account the effect of rough water and drowning, or increasing the rate of onset of hypothermia due to energy expended in rough water. The graph also does not take into account the hypothermia protection provided by any clothing the individual may be wearing. Nevertheless, no better survival time prediction method has been developed for general use. So I think the Coast Guard recognizes that this is I guess, a best guess. And obviously in this situation, looking at the individuals who did not survive, they were within the time in the water of these charts, but nevertheless did not survive the accident.
Have we filed comments on these Coast Guard proposed regulations?
Yes, we have.
And to what effect on this particular point?
Well, we're saying that we want 100% of the passengers and crew out of the water into one of these inflatable rafts,
Regardless of temperature, or do we?
regardless of temperature.
And what's the cost factor involved in this?
For a raft like that, approximately $1,500 for an inflatable raft such as that one there.
And to hold 100% of the capacity of the El Toro, how many rafts would that take?
Well, if they were 20-man rafts, it would take 3.
And these, what are the apparatus? Whatever the plural of apparatus is, what do they cost? What does one of them cost? What does one
Well, they're
apparatus
much-
cost?
I would say they're much less. They're
They're just,
just a
K-Pop out there,
inflatable
right?
device with lines hanging off.
well, they're not even inflatable, are they? Aren't they rigid?
They're rigid.
Yeah, yeah.
There's 2 kinds here. One is what they call a life float. That's the one that has a small floor in it. It's a wooden floor that hangs beneath the raft, and it's plywood or cedar, and it's placed there on a netting. And that's called a life float. The other one is just a rigid apparatus, which is the one below it.
How much did you say those cost, roughly?
Oh, these? I don't know. Well, I was talking about life.
Yeah, I understood the 1,500 for the inflatable, but
That may have a price on it. Looks like it's an ad.
It is.
No?
No.
well, I think again I agree with staff the direction you've taken here that the only good way to deal with this is to keep people out of the water. I'm not sure that there shouldn't be some provision made for water temperature for boats operating in areas where water temperature would never go below some conservatively chosen cutoff. I could accept that, but in a case like the Chesapeake Bay, where assuming these boats are going to be operating a fairly lengthy season, you'd take sort of the worst case situation there and make sure that everyone was covered. But I think the only way in the bay situation particularly is to keep them out of the water.
Do we know whether there's a stability factor, or the apparatus more stable than these in rough water, these inflatables? I know we used to put sea anchors out on them, and they were pretty stable.
In extremely rough sea conditions, the inflatable would be subject to capsize. The manufacturers of inflatable survival craft have tried to use various techniques to improve the stability, and it's something that they're continually working on, but still that is a possibility. And if it happened, they're designed that you can board them from either side. You would have to climb back aboard, but at least you would have that option to get out of the water.
What has been the Coast Guard's objection to our recommendations?
They haven't objected to our recommendations. They have in fact said that they would take our recommendations into account when they did their proposed rulemaking. And their proposed rulemaking, as you can see, still leaves much to be desired with regard to our recommendations.
And when did they start working on the present rulemaking? Is this the 1981, 89?
I think about 1989 is when we started with the notice of proposed rulemaking, the initial notice of proposed rulemaking. What they have proposed now is in a supplemental notice of proposed rulemaking. That came out the early part of this year. We have submitted our comments to that, and again reiterated our recommendations.
Any other comments on the life-saving devices?
Just one quick question. Did each of the 23 people don a personal flotation device?
Yes, they did.
And were there any problems at all concerning the fit of those PFDs or their adequacy?
They were extremely old. They were manufactured in the 50s. The only comments I had from the passengers and the crew were that when they were lifted out of the water into the 41-foot Coast Guard boat, the straps tore, and they would come off. They would drop back into the water, and then they had to be rescued again for the second time. That was the only comments I had. They were very old.
So that's a pertinent comment if it happened to you.
Would you, do you think that information should be in the final report?
Well, it's the second time I've run into it. It was in the Bronx Queen had the same thing. Most of these personal flotation devices that they have aboard these fishing vessels are very old. And I haven't had any where they wouldn't fit properly. They seem to fit. They have child ones and they have the adult ones. But they are old and they do rip.
Are they required to be inspected on some periodic basis?
Yes, they are. They're inspected by the Coast Guard.
Does this say that the periodic inspection requirements are not sufficient or are not being adequately accomplished?
Well,
I'm disturbed by the observation that you just made that is not, to my knowledge, in the report.
Well, I did look at them, and they were inspected, and they were inspected recently by the Coast Guard.
Well, I certainly think that should be included in the report.
I mean, what's your conclusion about what the implications of that are? I mean, they were inspected, and yet you say that you had indications that some of these things
They definitely tore.
tore.
Yeah.
What? Don't you? I mean, do you conclude something from this?
I do. I concluded they're old, and that if they're placed in service in that condition, that's what's going to happen to them.
But under some circumstances, couldn't this result in, say, loss of life? I mean, I'm disturbed by the fact that we're just throwing this out on the table and not apparently doing anything with it. Am I missing something?
Is this something the working group's working on?
No, Mr. Chairman, they're not. They're looking at inspection of hull materials only. My information on life jackets is that there were some old ones, there were some new ones, and a couple might have torn, all of them did not tear. Some of them were cut deliberately with a knife in order to free up people. So there's a mixture of different ages of life jackets on board the vessel, and photographs of the life jackets have been put on the docket. And the information regarding the life jackets.
Do we have any of those to look at?
No, we do not have the life jackets. The photographs, unfortunately, I do not have them here with me.
It is staff's position that with regard to this issue, there isn't an issue that the safety board needs to pursue further.
We did not see any evidence where it had affected their ability to float in the water. It did not. None of the survivors complained that.
But excuse me, isn't one of the issues here the amount of time it took to get these folks out of the water?
Yes, and that related primarily to the freeboard of the vessels and the difficulty in lifting them up that high.
Well,
It seems to me there's an issue here involving the adequacy of inspection of life jackets that we ought to address.
Sure does.
And that some textual consideration should be given to what we've just been talking about, and a recommendation along that line, because I'm just recalling anecdotally now, but there is a Coast Guard requirement for inspection of life preservers, and they need to be a general provision that they need to be serviceable and in good shape and so forth. And the evidence here seems to be that at least some of these were not. And if they break when you're hoisting someone out of the water, I think that's a problem.
if you were going up on a helicopter, it'd be more of a problem.
One of the one of the considerations in this regard is that inspections are routinely conducted at the beginning of the season, and, you know, this was the end of the season, and so, you know, it's to be expected that some devices that might be borderline acceptable at the beginning of the season might be unacceptable at the end of the season and would be expected to not pass in the next inspection. Now, I'm not saying this is the case, but this is an inspection item that out of each year there's going to be a certain number of life preservers that will be rejected, and it's a standard thing to be expected. I'm not sure that this is indicative of something that we can recommend a
Well, it could-
remedial action.
It's conceivable that there was sufficient deterioration between the beginning of the season and the time this accident happened to result in the situation we saw here. Mr. Deagle's comment with regard to these were they were very old, which suggests that perhaps this deterioration had been around somewhat longer than since the beginning of the season. In any event, we still have a problem. I mean, it was noted that some of these did not perform properly. They tore, and either the inspection wasn't done adequately or the inspection interval isn't proper, but there's something that needs to be addressed here, and I agree with Member Vogt that we should pursue it.
Mr. Chairman, maybe the staff could suggest a recommendation that the Coast Guard review its inspection procedures for these life preservers to determine if they are actually figuring out if they are serviceable or not. Take a look at what they're doing. I think that would be a useful recommendation with some supporting information in the body of the report.
Yeah, as John points out, we may not have a problem here with the regulation, but the carrying out of it, it's hard to know. But we don't have in front of us the regulation at this point. So certainly I would agree a review of the regulation and also of the way in which it's carried out.
Of course, PFD use has been an ongoing safety issue at the board for many years, and I think maybe we ought to also do a search of our existing recommendations on that before we perhaps issue a new one.
Yes, we'll go ahead and include a discussion of the PFDs, their condition, and their inspection, and make appropriate recommendations.
There is very little in the safety business that is as personal as a PFD when you're in trouble. I've used one in trouble, and I kept mine for 30 years and used to go down and talk to it on occasion. I think it's extremely important.
Well, let's continue on with the rescue. Could you, once the El Toro got in trouble and the captain recognized that he had an emergency situation, could you describe to us in some detail the notification from the El Toro to the Coast Guard and then what took place from that point forward?
At 1400, the El Toro notified the U.S. Coast Guard station at St. Indicos, Maryland. Told them that they were in trouble, that they were sinking.
Could you identify where that is on the map?
On the other side. Right there.
Okay. Thank you.
Just above that a little bit. Right there.
So approximately how many miles from the site, just roughly?
24, 25 miles.
Okay.
And around 1403, the crew instructed the passengers to put on their PFDs, which they did. The 41-foot utility boat left St. Indicos at 14:05, approximately 5 minutes after they were notified. It took them approximately 40 to 45 minutes to arrive at the site. When they arrived, the first thing they observed was a lone swimmer in the water.
Could you describe this boat for us before we get into the actual actions that took place when they reached the El Toro?
This is not a rescue boat. This is a 41-foot utility boat. It's used for towing purposes and everything else. It's not basically designed for survival, recovery of people in the water. So there was a problem with this particular boat in lifting the people over the freeboard, which is that area there, and getting them inside the boat. It's a very high freeboard, and it's very difficult to lift these persons who are waterlogged and are very heavy to get them over there. They can't take them around to the rear of the boat because of the prop, and so they have to do it on the sides of the... fortunately, in this instance, there were 9 crew members that responded. They were training at the time, and which helped considerably in getting these people up and out of the water. If it was just 3, a regular crew, an engineer, coxswain, and a crew member, they would have had great difficulty.
While we're discussing the vessel, could you show us then what a rescue craft looks like? Do you have a picture of one of those?
44
And the difference?
That's the 44-footer, which is designed altogether differently.
And where would people be pulled in?
Right away, right in the middle, midships. Much lower. And there's a 47-footer which has a cutout so that you can bring people in. You don't have a picture of that.
Do you have a picture of that?
No. After they got the lone swimmer into the boat, which took approximately 5 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes, they observed 3 passengers on the pilot house of the sunken vessel. They could see that the other 19, they didn't know there were 19 on the buoyant apparatus, but they could see them over there, and they felt that they were fairly secure. They responded over to the sunken vessel and lowered a life raft, 4-man life raft, off the rear end of the Coast Guard cutter, and with 2 swimmers, and it took them a considerable length of time to get the 3 persons off that vessel. They had to make several passes because of the high seas and the winds and whatnot. So that took them approximately 20 minutes. While they were accomplishing that...
Did they have a out-of-water flotation device on that utility boat that they could have put those folks in, or, you know? They had to take them directly on the boat. There wasn't any...
Oh, there wasn't, no.
Any other...
There's no other device. At this time, beginning the middle of September, each station house will be issued I call it a buoyant apparatus with a step, so that they can get the people up out of the water onto this step and then into the boat.
Excuse me, did I understand correctly that they launched an inflatable raft with 2 swimmers to get the people off of the deck house of the El Toro?
That's right.
All right. And so they got into that raft and then were transported to the vessel.
They got into the raft and trailed the 41-footer. The 41-footer went upwind.
Yeah.
And drifted them back to the El Toro.
Right, okay. But the people they were taking off of the apparatus, they took them right over the side.
That's right.
Okay.
No, they had a life raft. They had 2 life rafts at that time. Some they took over the side, and some they put in life rafts, brought them alongside, and then got them into
And took them in.
And all 19, I thought I'd heard some reference to helicopters.
Yes, while the 41-footer was taking the 3 survivors off the pilot house, a Maryland State Police helicopter arrived on the scene,
Who dispatched that helicopter?
Maryland State Police.
I mean, is it part of the normal search and rescue? Who has the responsibility for the rescue of the individuals from this
The
vessel?
Coast Guard.
The Coast Guard has this
That's
responsibility.
right. They were working as an addition. They were standing by, and they would be helpful if they could. And that's what they did. They
The
came
state
out.
police.
State police.
But my question is, were they requested to be there by the Coast Guard? Were there previous procedures or drills that they had participated in?
They were
Was this a
called.
standard, what we call in the military, SOP? Was this something that was normally done?
No. They called the Maryland State Police and the fire department over 911. Told them what they had. Asked the fire department to respond to Point Lookout to set up a triage area and a location for the helicopters to land. The Maryland State Police were notified, and they sent 2 helicopters. The one that arrived on the scene first was not equipped with survival apparatus. They could not pick up anybody. So the 41
Where did the helicopters leave from?
Point Lookout.
Point Lookout. Is there a highway patrol's got an office there, a base?
No, it's a big parking lot adjacent to a dock where these boats are pulled in.
Okay.
A big gigantic parking lot.
How this rescue operation was conducted is extremely important, and I would appreciate you giving as much detail as you have in regard to the participants and how they got there, so that the board can have a feeling of how this procedure was conducted.
The state police helicopter that arrived on the scene while the 41-footer was taking the passenger up the pilot house was in radio communication with the coxswain. The coxswain asked them to canvass the area to see if there were any other lone survivors out there floating around, because they hadn't gotten a count at that time.
This is the coxswain on the Coast Guard utility boat?
Yeah.
Okay.
Which the Coast Guard, with the state police did do. They reconnoitered the area. 7 minutes later, Coast Guard a U.S. Navy helicopter arrived on the scene, lowered 2 swimmers to the flotation device with the 19 people, one life raft, and began to assess and triage who was going to be lifted first.
Who was there first, or do we know? Was the utility boat there with the swimmers and the life raft for the people on the flotation device, or was the helicopter the first folks for the people on the
The
float?
helicopters were first. The utility boat was still picking up the 3 officers. They had trouble, and it took them 20 minutes.
20 minutes to get the 3 people out of the
That's
water.
right. During that time, the helicopters arrived.
Okay.
The 2 swimmers assessed the passenger that are cleaning off the device. They realized that they had 2 people that were deteriorating, plus a female and a child. Those were the first 4 that were lifted from the device up into the helicopter,
And exactly how were they lifted?
and up in a basket-type device.
We don't have a picture of that, do we?
All told, 10 survivors were lifted from the buoyant apparatus into helicopters. By this time, 10 minutes after the Navy helicopter arrived, a Coast Guard helicopter arrived, placed 2 swimmers in the water and another life raft.
By the time they arrived, though, 9 of the 19 had been put on the state police helicopter.
No. The state police helicopter didn't pick up anybody. It was not equipped to pick anybody up.
I'm lost. Which helicopter did they go into?
Navy.
The Navy helicopter. Okay. That's the one with the basket, and it picked the 9 up, right?
And after the Navy helicopter picked up the 4 that I just mentioned, the Coast Guard helicopter arrived on the scene, and they picked up some more. A total of 10 for all that were picked up by helicopters.
Now, where did the Coast Guard helicopter come from?
Cape May, New Jersey.
Was that the closest Coast Guard helicopter?
It's 83 miles away, it's closest one.
And the Navy helicopter, where did it come from?
Patuxent Naval Air Base,
And how far away is that?
around 30, 35 miles.
And that was called by the
Coast Guard.
Coast Guard. So the Coast Guard was aware that in an emergency situation such as this, the Navy has the closest helicopter.
That's right.
Okay.
After they recovered the 10 people from the water, the 41-footer moved in and brought about the rest of the people that were aboard that flotation device. The helicopters left and went back to Point Lookout for triage. The Coast Guard utility boat began its trip back to Point Lookout. Partway back, 2 more passengers deteriorated, their condition deteriorated, and the Coast Guard cut a coxswain, asked for the helicopter to return, which the Coast Guard helicopter returned, picked up 2 passengers, and flew them back to Point Lookout.
The 3 individuals that did not survive and died of hypothermia, where were they? Did we identify exactly when they were picked up, and were they on the Coast Guard utility boat, or were they picked up by the helicopter?
The first, a 65-year-old male was picked up by helicopter. He was the first one, because he was deteriorating real bad. The 19-year-old crew member was picked up by the 41-footer first, when the 41-footer got there. The 45-year-old male that was last picked up died as a result of the hypothermia. He was the last one.
But was he on the utility boat or in the helicopter?
He was on the utility boat. He was picked up by the utility boat and then transferred to the helicopter.
Okay.
But he helped everybody else. That was one of the things everybody had said, that he was very busy helping everybody else. On the way in, after the Coast Guard helicopter picked up the 2 off the 41-footer, which was a 19-year-old and the 45-year-old, the Navy helicopter returned and picked up 2 divers and another passenger and transferred them off the 41-footer to Point Lookout.
Did we find in our investigation that prior to the departure, the passengers aboard this vessel were given any type of emergency briefing or information in terms of how to use the PFDs, or anything about hypothermia or any situation that might happen in case of an emergency or in case the ship had to be evacuated?
No,
the boat had to be evacuated?
I interviewed the passengers, and they received no safety orientation.
And do we know, in part of our investigation, when was the last time the Coast Guard conducted a drill for a rescue of this nature in the Chesapeake Bay waters?
The Coast Guard or the local authorities? The local authorities had a...
Well, who has the responsibility?
For disaster drills?
No, for this rescue.
Coast Guard.
Okay. When was the last time they had a drill simulation for a rescue in the Chesapeake Bay area? Do we know?
They have those all the time, because they're qualifying people at all times. So they're using these drills, but they do that on their own. They're not in connection with the Ridge Fire Department. They do those drills all the time.
They do not coordinate with the Navy, with the Highway Patrol, with the Fire Department, with the other people who were participants in this rescue?
No.
Diggle, you said that no safety briefings were given?
That's right.
Were any required?
No.
There is no requirement
there's
for
no
a safety
requirement.
briefing of any kind in this kind of operation?
Just a safety placard that goes aboard the ship.
And it didn't, the evidence indicates that it had no bearing on the outcome here, so, but I just wanted to make sure that, that we hadn't overlooked something. Apparently we have not.
I guess, John, my concern about it, and I understand there was no requirement, and therefore I'm not, but my concern is that these individuals evidently, at least two of them, possibly lost their life by the exertion that they expended in an effort to help their other passengers. And had they known with all of these folks there that that basically that put them at a greater risk by doing that, and there were adequate people there to handle the rescue, that information could have possibly saved their lives. That's obviously highly speculative, but that type of information could be beneficial, particularly since the weather chart or weather graph that the Coast Guard uses is based on how long you can survive in that water, and that is then dependent on activity and a whole lot of other factors.
Both the 19-year-old and the 45-year-old males, both were very, very active, according to the other passengers' statements.
How were these people clothed?
They had cold weather clothing on, suitable for fishing in November.
John? Paul?
Nothing, one quick point, it's not too major, but when we're talking about this, this ramp, this inflatable ramp to rescue people onto the Coast Guard vessels, would it be in order to include a depiction of that in the report? Just reading it, a reader doesn't get a full visualization, I don't believe, of what that actually looks like, or what it is. Thank you.
I've got some questions here on page 50 and 51. I'm a little bit confused between Coast Guard were you finished?
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Between Coast Guard regulations that apply to small passenger vessels, which are discussed on page 50, and what I perceive to be a difference between those regulations and regulations for vessels on lakes, bays, and sound routes. Is there a distinction between those requirements? We pose that here. We describe them in ways that make them...
If I might help the board, one's a subset of the other. The Coast Guard regulations for small passenger vessels, they'll have different regulations if a vessel is on lakes, bays, and sounds versus offshore versus coastal. And that gets back to our previous discussion that the amount of life-saving equipment may vary depending upon the area of operation of the passenger vessel.
Well, let's take a small passenger vessel on the Chesapeake Bay, which is, I understand, the category of the El Toro. And on page 50 here, we discuss the Coast Guard SNPRM to provide a grandfather clause. I mean, the text there indicates that they have a requirement for out-of-the-water flotation devices that would be required on small passenger vessels, but for the grandfather clause, and that we take issue with them on the grandfather clause. On the next page, and what you showed us, was that chart which has to do with 59-degree water temperature and no requirement for out-of-water devices, which would not seem, at least as I read this, to be relevant to our current consideration of a small passenger vessel on the Chesapeake Bay.
Yes, I think we've taken issue with both, Mr. Chairman, on the grandfather clause, which permits existing vessels to retain existing life-saving equipment on board as long.
Ash, what does it require for non-existing vessels?
For new vessels,
Yes.
the NPRM proposes that they be equipped with in-the-water flotation of life floats for 100% of the people on board, as long as the temperature of the water is below 59 degrees Fahrenheit. If the temperature of the water is above 59, then nothing is required. And this is only for vessels on lakes, bays, and sounds.
Let me just address this text here because I'm still confused. I'm on page 50. The Coast Guard has indicated in its response, this was to a recommendation in 9014, that the retrofitting of existing vessels with inflatable buoyant apparatus and life rafts would be addressed in its SNPRM. This is referring, as I take it, to a recommendation we had made that there be out-of-the-water flotation provided on all these small passenger vessels. However, the SNPRM proposes a grandfather clause that permits existing vessels to retain survival craft if considered serviceable for an indefinite time. Now that indicates to me that it is the grandfather clause that we take issue with. We go on to say, because retaining inadequate survival craft would not improve vessel safety, has consistently opposed to exempting such existing survival craft from replacement. The implication here is that for those not covered by the grandfather clause, that we do not take issue.
We take issue with new vessels on the second page, on page 51. On page 50, we made a recommendation that such inadequate equipment be phased out within 5 years, which is on line 10, which is recommendation M9014. The Coast Guard NPRM has been disappointing because it does not propose that these be phased out within 5 years, but says that they can be kept on indefinitely, as long as they're considered serviceable. And that's kind of the category the PFDs fall in, where the Coast Guard thought they were serviceable. But this relating to different items, of course.
A member vote, I might point out that when the Coast Guard responded to this recommendation, they actually stated that they concurred and that they determined that the inflatable buoyant apparatus and life rafts are justified and existing vessels will be required to retrofit these devices. And they further say the final phase-in period has yet to be decided. However, the proposed starting with existing vessels that were 10 or more years old, beginning 5 years after publication of this rule, which would have complied with our recommendation. But when the supplemental notice came out, that requirement was not there, and they are now allowing, or now proposing to allow, this grandfather clause, which the staff takes exception to.
So the net result of that is that this chart you showed us, the 59 degrees, would apply across the board to small passenger vessels operating in bays, sounds, and so on and so forth.
Right.
So there's been a definite move backward then from their response to our recommendation.
Yes.
And we put this on our most wanted list this year as a result of that. Do we refer in our recommendations, I know we'll get to that, to our most wanted list or to our existing recommendation?
In section on page 50 and 51.
No, I mean in our recommendations.
What the staff is actually proposing is to close these two recommendations superseded unacceptable and being replaced with a new recommendation, which makes it very clear what the board...
Where's our new recommendation?
The new recommendation is discussed on the top of page 52, the last, on line 4.
And that's our recommendation number 5 on page 57?
Yes,
Is
but
that
it's the rationale for it is discussed on 52, and it's recommendation number 5, line 17 on page 57.
Okay.
Anything additional? One last item before we move to the conclusions. Also referenced in our report is the work of the Passenger Vessel Association in producing a document risk management control program for passenger vessel safety. I was just wondering whether that, we found in our investigation whether that information had gotten to the owners of the El Toro, and if any of those recommendations of the Passenger Vessel Association had been implemented.
I do not believe that the owner of the El Toro is a member of this particular association. He is a member of the Maryland Charter Boat Operators Association, which is also mentioned in this report. So he would not automatically get a copy of this being a non-member of this association. Again, the safety audit guide does not talk about inspections of wooden hull fasteners. It talks more about the commonest types of safety accidents, which are mainly slips and falls and tripping hazards and things of that nature, which are comparatively a lot more general.
Well, the thing that got my attention is it also requires a pre-departure safety announcement and information that I think would possibly be pertinent. But let us move into the conclusions, unless any of the board members have any other comments or questions in regard to the report. Okay, conclusion number 1. The qualifications and experience of the crew were adequate. Neither alcohol or drug usage nor failure of the vessel equipment were found to be causal factors in the accident. Conclusion number 2. The emergency...
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman. We said neither alcohol or drug usage nor failure of the vessel equipment. What equipment are we talking about? I mean, it was the engine failure and the failure of the hull that caused this.
Referring to how electrical and mechanical type of equipment, the engine did not fail of itself due to a mechanical malfunction.
Well, I think we ought to just say that then.
Okay.
I think we should get rid of causal too. They weren't factors, period, in this accident. Causal, contributory, or otherwise.
Do you need a minute, or could you restate that for us?
The second sentence of conclusion 1 would read, neither alcohol or drug usage nor failure of the propulsion engine were found to be factors in this accident.
I should say vessel systems. Propulsion, radio, nav.
Okay. Vessels, mechanical and electrical systems.
That's fine.
Number 2, the emergency response and rescue efforts of the Coast Guard and all other emergency rescue services were appropriate, timely, and effective. And I guess this is based on the regulations that outline what is supposed to be done in this area. Number 3, the decision of the owner and operator of the El Toro II to embark on the fishing trip and to remain at the fishing grounds until the weather began to deteriorate were reasonable. Number 4, The El Toro 2 sank because severely corroded fasteners caused 3 bottom planks to disengage from the keel in the 6 to 8 foot seas, and the vessel flooded. Number 5, the Coast Guard and the small passenger vessel industry do not provide adequate guidance to inspectors or owners for conducting hull inspections of wooden vessels to check for corroded fasteners.
I think in view of the discussion that we had on this issue, I don't know, there are a couple things. I'm not sure adequate is the right term, although I wasn't able to come up with a suggestion for one that's better. But at least, well, I'd like to have us consider adding something to the effect that, however, the safety board notes that inspection alone, however well done, is not sufficient to ensure structural integrity in wooden hulled vessels. To sort of bring it all together, I mean, yes, there are improvements that can be made in the inspection program and guidance, but it's not, I think we all agreed that the evidence indicates that that in and of itself is probably not sufficient. There are some circumstances under which we could still have problems.
I would suggest that we make that as a separate conclusion.
Could do that too.
Which leads into number 6, which is our need for non-destructive.
Safety board concludes that inspection alone, however well done, yeah.
If you would, then, what correction do you have to number 5, and then if you would restate for us, John, if
Well,
you
I don't
could,
know that I
number
have
6.
any.
Leave number 5 as it is.
I guess leave it alone.
There would be a new number 6, which would,
However, the safety board concludes that inspection alone, however well done, is not sufficient to ensure structural integrity in wooden hulled vessels.
does anyone, Ash, do you have that down?
Yes, sir, I do.
Carl?
Yeah, I would just, our focus here is on the fasteners. And I guess I would suggest that we focus that on the fasteners, because the overall integrity, I think, goes to caulking and all of that kind of thing, and we just haven't considered those issues.
Is not sufficient to ensure
The integrity
of the fasteners
Right.
used in wooden hulled vessels.
Right,
Yeah.
right, yes. Okay.
I would feel more comfortable if someone over on that side would read that off for us, so we're sure we got it. Ralph, do you have it down, or who has it?
I have it, I think.
Okay, Marjorie.
However, the safety board concludes that inspection alone, no matter how well done, is not adequate to assure the structural integrity of the fasteners in wooden hull vessels.
I would say no matter how well prescribed or done.
Like me to read that again?
Please.
However, the safety board concludes that inspection alone, no matter how well prescribed or done, is not adequate to assure the structural integrity of fasteners in wooden hull vessels.
Good.
Substitute accomplished for done.
Would it improve it, or detract from it, to say, rather than inspection, say current inspection methods?
Yeah, that's good, because that leaves it open for the non-destructive.
One more time?
One more time.
However, the safety board concludes that current inspection methods alone, no matter how well prescribed or accomplished, are not adequate to assure the structural integrity of fasteners in wooden hull vessels.
Okay.
Number 7, non-destructive inspection techniques need to be developed for the inspection of fasteners on wooden hull vessels.
Back to the last one, just a little bit more wordsmithing. You don't need the however in there anymore, since it's a standalone safety board.
The safety board concludes.
I think
Number 8, given the inspection and maintenance standards prevailing in the wooden vessel industry, the vessel owner made reasonable efforts to maintain the structural integrity of the El Toro 2. Number 9, given the Coast Guard inspection policy for wooden-hulled small passenger vessels, the Coast Guard inspectors made a reasonable effort to evaluate the structural integrity of the El Toro 2. Number 10, had the El Toro 2 been required by the Coast Guard to be equipped with bilge alarms, the operator may have learned of the flooding in time to prevent or delay the sinking.
I agree with the point, but I don't think I agree with the conclusion. What I think would be more appropriate would be to say bilge alarms would have provided a more timely notice of the flooding to the operator. But I think given the nature of the flooding that occurred in this case, it's unlikely that that would have prevented or delayed the flooding significantly. If staff disagrees, say so. Tell us how it would have effectively delayed the flooding, or what action he could have taken to delay it.
The way the flooding, the sinking could have been delayed is possibly by the operator going down into the engine compartment, which had not flooded yet. The alarm would tell him that the compartment forward of it had started to flood. At that time, he would then enter the engine compartment, and there were 3 holes, drainage holes at the bottom of the bulkhead, and he would attempt to plug that with whatever he had handy, and that might keep the engine going for a while. That would let him come closer to shore or to the shallows, and that would be his chance.
All right, I withdraw my comment in that case.
Okay. Number 11. Had the El Toro 2 been required by the Coast Guard to have out-of-the-water survival craft on board, the 3 deaths may not have occurred.
I think we need to consider one additional conclusion, and it goes back to the discussion we had with regard to the adequacy of inspection programs, both now and in the future. And Member Vogt pointed out that the focus here ought to be on the fasteners, because that was sort of the critical issue in this case. And it seems to me that the use of non-corrosive or Monel fasteners, for example, could be considered, in a sense, almost a terminating action for required inspection programs in this case. I mean, it obviates this problem, I believe. Is that true? I mean, anybody want to take exception to that? The point I'm getting to is I'd like to see us consider a conclusion to the effect that had this hull been fastened with Monel fasteners, we don't believe this accident would have happened. I mean, I think that's a conclusion we can reach.
But we could say it's unlikely that this
or is unlikely.
But I think we need to say had it originally been constructed, because we do have the problem of the dissimilar metals issue. Potential problem.
Yeah, we haven't really substantiated that argument directly, but evidence would say that Monel is a highly corrosion-resistant material, and we have seen some evidence on the limited sample that has been taken that Monel has withstood the years that the boat was in service. So, based on that, it's certainly a much better material. There's no question about that. That this vessel would not have sunk, we haven't gone the full length to establish that report.
Would a way to treat that be in recommendations 6 and 7 to talk about the inspection of galvanized fasteners or non-corrosion resistant?
What?
I don't know what
I hear your point. the very least, it seems to me we can conclude that evidence indicates that Monell fasteners are much less subject to corrosion than are the galvanized fasteners as were used on the El Toro.
Yes.
Which then sets us up for the recommendations that we
And,
choose to get after.
and that would be based on the,
On the observations in the Philadelphia zone, as well as material science.
yeah, I think I'd support a conclusion to that effect.
Would you like to state one, or do you all have one to state?
I think what Member Lawver said, evidence indicates that Monell fasteners are much less subject to corrosion
Than the galvanized
than
fasteners
the
as
galvanized
used in
fasteners
the
used
El
on the El Toro.
That would become conclusion number 12.
Well, I might, for the sake of continuity, move it up to just after our new number 6.
Okay. We will renumber and make that number 7, and then renumber the subsequent conclusions. The permission of the board, I'll go ahead and read the probable cause, and we will vote on the conclusions and probable cause at the same time. The probable cause of the El Toro 2 sinking was catastrophic flooding resulting from severely corroded hull fasteners that had remained undetected because of the lack of effective policies and procedures for inspecting and maintaining the structural integrity of wooden hull vessels. Contributing to the loss of lives was the lack of survival craft capable of providing out-of-the-water flotation for passenger and crew.
Well, I've got some concern about our first conclusion.
I do
In
too.
light of our conversation.
Except that the conjunction there, it's a combination of inspection and maintenance that, if anything, will save this probable cause. I guess it's that conjunction that will, but I share your concerns about what we're saying about inspection, even though we've conceived of ways that it could be improved. It's not. This makes a very strong statement that I'm not sure is entirely supported by the record.
Well, in the broadest sense, it certainly is an accurate statement.
Yeah.
The issue that gets begged is our concern that there is such an effective policy or procedure. I mean, we imply that there could be effective policies and procedures, but we really don't know what they are.
Well, and they could be remedial as well as...
We
Or-
could
or
say for
inspection process.
inspecting, maintaining, and remediating the structural integrity of wooden hull and/or remediating, something like that. Because I don't think we've got in mind anything except hopefully some research that sometime might come up with a non-destructive technique, but that's pure speculation at this
What
point.
about inspecting, maintaining, and remediating?
Or remediating.
Or remediating.
To me, the issue of remediation is encapsulated in the idea of maintenance, but I don't feel strongly about it one way or another.
Or we could say maintaining, including remediating. I think this is an accurate statement, but I mean, this is what people are going to see, and I'm not sure it includes all of our thoughts on it, in the sense that, again, it seems to me to suggest that we think that there is a way to do it. And I guess the only way I think there is to do it that we would all agree on is some kind of maintenance that would be remedial in the sense of either replacing or supplementing the fasteners.
See, I think there are. I mean, one of the things we've learned from this lesson, for example, is the vulnerability in this kind of vessel of that specific area, the specific area that was concerned, or that was a factor in this accident. You take that information and feed it back to the inspection program for existing vessels and say, alert inspectors to the fact that these vessels are susceptible in this area is an improvement in the inspection program that could in fact significantly improve the probability of detecting similar problems on similar vessels. So there are some things that can be done in the inspection arena apart from the technology thing that could have improved, could improve in the long run.
I agree it would improve it, but we're saying here it caused it. That's the probable cause. What if we said the lack of effective policies and procedures for inspecting or supplementing the structural integrity of wooden hull vessels? Now, we're not coming up with a recommendation, or somewhere along the line we may, on
Mr. Chairman.
supplementation.
Yes, one of the languages that's come up in the work group before as a matter of improving the inspection procedure was a sample-driven database that would establish a risk profile which could be collected and disseminated throughout the country for utilization by inspectors. I think that's the part that Member Lauber's looking for, that you can be a bit more strategic about selecting and analyzing those areas of these wood